I'm Alison Uncles, the editor-in-chief of Maclean's magazine. Welcome to Maclean's Live. Tonight, Paul Wells in conversation with Stephen Poloz, Governor of the Bank of Canada, of course. We'd like to thank, first of all, our partners in this event, CPAC, our broadcast partner, and the NAC, of course, for this amazing room. Just a few little housekeeping items. Please, if you could turn your phones to vibrate. This is a live broadcast, so we like to keep the noise to a minimum. And if you do need to zip in and out during the broadcast, if you could do so quietly. You don't need to be quiet afterwards. There's a lovely cocktail party next door. You're all invited. And importantly, we'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, the Canadian Bankers Association. The CBA has been with us for more than a year on this series, and they've sponsored all kinds of talks across a wide variety of topics and personalities. But tonight is a banking talk. You know, it's like their Super Bowl, their Oscars, their Stanley Cup final. So Neil Parmenter, the CEO of CBA, is here tonight to introduce Paul. Thanks so much. Have a good night.
Well, thanks very much, Alison, and welcome to everyone here. This is a bit of our Super Bowl here. As we said, we've been with Maclean since the start of this series, and we think it's an incredibly important one for the country. It brings together thought leaders, politicians, policymakers, journalists, artists, and others that are contributing to a view on the future of Canada, and in this case, and certainly tonight, a view on the future of the economy of Canada, which is of great interest to all of us, including our industry. In introducing Paul, I just want to really commend him for his leadership on this series. We think it's an incredibly important one, and he's been an absolutely outstanding collaborator and thought leader to partner with on this important initiative. I'm really looking forward to hearing tonight's comments. I had an opportunity to speak to the governor a few moments ago, and I know Paul has a wide range of questions for him beyond interest rates. So I'm looking forward to tonight's talk. I hope you are as well. And with that, I'd like to welcome Paul Wells to the stage.
I want to thank Neil. I want to thank the Canadian Bankers Association. I have no idea what the rules are around this thing. And so I realized a couple of weeks ago that I had a banker who was coming, and our sponsors are bankers, and I wanted to make sure that everyone was cool. So I checked with the Bank of Canada, and they said no problem. And I checked with the Canadian Bankers Association, no problem. So I want to thank everyone for being just kind of easy to deal with this month. And I want to let you in on, after I thank our dear friends of the National Arts Centre who give us month after month after month access to what I think is the best room in Canada for this kind of conversation with the best view. And our friends at CPAC who help us to get all this interesting content out to Canadians. It's a really good partnership that we have. I want to let you in on a bit of a planning consideration that I have. There's a federal election in October, and I decided last Christmas that I would try and get all the way through 2019 without having any elected members of Parliament representing any of the parties as my guest. Because in an election year, it's just human nature, they're insufferable. It's all slogans. It's all attacks on the other person. It's all why the other party is just pestilential and you can't come anywhere close to them. But that presents a programming challenge for a program like ours, because we need to have interesting guests who have interesting things that they're doing, who are influential and matter to Canadian society. And when I was thinking about who to get for this month, suddenly it all came together. Everyone's watching what the Bank of Canada is doing. Everyone's got their eye on it. And yet it's an institution that I think a lot of Canadians, certainly your humble correspondent included, don't really understand very well. So I thought, what better guest than Stephen Poloz, the Governor of the Bank of Canada, and I'm really grateful to him for coming. Governor? And of course, you are a public servant, so I will emphasize that I'm the one who said partisans are insufferable. That you didn't say anything like that.
No comment.
It's the last time you're allowed to say that tonight.
Okay.
I want to begin by thanking you for not raising interest rates yesterday.
It's my pleasure. I'm happy to take care of that for you.
Yeah. yesterday was one of your periodic monetary policy announcements, and it was the third time you have passed up a chance to raise interest rates.
Yep.
What are the factors that go into a calculation like that?
So it's interesting the way you put it, passed up on an opportunity to raise interest rate. It kind of makes it sound like that's all we like to do, but it's untrue. But really the way this works is policy is made roughly 2 years ahead of time. So the staff are busy bringing all the latest data to their models and forecasting inflation 2 years down the road. And if forces are acting in the economy in such a way that inflation looks like it's going to go above our target 2 years from now, well, now is the time to act to try to slow that down so that it does not go above our target. Because it takes, it takes 6 to 8 quarters for our moves to affect inflation. So we're always making policy in the future. It's a really important concept. Most people think, well, inflation goes up today, you need to react. Well, it's way too late. And the fact that inflation's on target today means you were doing the right things 2 years ago. And you recall, we had a rough period. We had the major oil price shock back at the end of 2014 and into 2015. So the fact that inflation's been on target for the past 2 years suggests that all that turned out pretty well in the end. But now we've got some forces acting that are a bit new. Another oil shock, which is from late last year, but also what's more important, I think, is a global shock, which is the trade war. So some 47 countries around the world have observed exactly the same slowdown that we've seen, and it takes the form of reluctance to invest. So companies, think of yourself as a company, you rely on a trading system, rules of trade, sell your products, and suddenly they're in doubt. People are putting tariffs on things, steel, aluminum, and then counter tariffs on lots of things. And so it makes your business model a little in doubt. And so you don't invest that extra money at a time when you really ought to be or want to be. You hesitate, you stop or slow down, and it's done that all around the world. And so we're being affected by the same thing.
Okay. In your announcement yesterday, you said that there are 4 broad baskets of policy considerations or of data considerations that affect your affect your call.
Right.
Oil, trade, housing, and fiscal policy. Can you walk us through those?
So oil is the most obvious one. You recall perhaps in October, November, December, not only were world oil prices rather weak compared to they've been lately, we also had a situation where Canadian oil was selling at a huge discount to the world oil price. And in that context, that just means less income for not just for oil producers, but for Canada in general. So that's a negative shock to Canada's income, our exports, et cetera. And so what's that happened now is that oil companies in Alberta in particular are saying, well, those investments we had in mind, we're putting those off for a while. The future of pipelines is unclear, combined with the low pricing, the lack of revenue that quarter. Revenues have come back, because the actions were taken. But the uncertainty persists about when will we be able to ship growing supply. And so in that case, they've decided they're going to cut investment by about another 20%. They cut it 50%, so now we're back in the last time. So we're way below levels we were at when oil was $90 or $100, understandably. So that's oil. So we think that that's basically a temporary thing because investment cuts take time, but when they're done, the rest of the growth in the economy continues to take over. So it's a transitory phenomenon. It still means that Alberta is adjusting to those forces, and that'll take time, but I don't mean it's over. But from a macro standpoint, it will influence the data less, our growth rate. If we look at I already talked about trade, and we have the special consideration here, not just the global trade war, but the uncertainty about CUSMA, or new NAFTA, which is now in doubt around ratification. So we had a sigh of relief last fall when we got the signing, but now the uncertainty's kind of come back. So that delays investment further. The third thing we talked about was housing. So housing's been a persistent issue for us. It's, we've gone from boom to bust, of course, with lots of new policies put in place. We think in the last 3 months we've come to understand it better, and put out some new research on that yesterday. And so basically we had a huge run-up in housing. There was fear of missing out. There was speculation in both Toronto and Vancouver, foreign buyers, all kinds of things fueling that. And that speculation has come out of the system now. So what we're waiting for now is for the froth to completely be gone in those two markets, and we're back to basics. The rest of the country is seeing exactly the same interest rates, exactly the same mortgage rules, and the markets are functioning extremely well. So that suggests it's all about the froth, okay? So we understand it better, but it needs a little more time for all that to settle out. And the last item was more fiscal policy, which is not often that we talk about fiscal policy, but the revision to the outlook for government spending in Ontario was sufficiently large that it affected our forecast for 2020, 2021. And so that too was mentioned and debated a little bit about how important that might be. It's not about what the policies are, it's just about the mechanics. It's arithmetic, actually. If they spend less money, it feeds into our model, and it means the economy will be just a little bit less strong than we thought before. But anyway, those are the four things that we wrestled with, and you can tell they're all kind of negative things. And wow, imagine that. But anyway, so in that situation, it seems to us that although all of that appears to be temporary, we need time to let the data prove to us that it's temporary. And we think that by mid-year, it'll be obvious.
Okay. Let me unpack at least those last two considerations. The housing market in British Columbia and in Ontario, in Toronto and Vancouver. It's cooling off. Is that a policy-driven cool-off? Have the governments of the federal government, government of British Columbia, government of Ontario, got a handle on what was overheating those markets, or has it been a consumer-driven relaxation in those markets?
Okay, so the answer to almost any question that you could frame up would be yes. And because all of those things matter. I mean, both Toronto and Vancouver, and we all know Vancouver's got a shortage of places to build houses. Yep. In Toronto, it's less obvious, but it's a very big city, and so actually you do, and all the zoning rules, et cetera. So there is a supply issue. So for example, the Toronto economy has been growing by about 5% per year. So that's driven by population growth, immigration, jobs growth, great strong economy. Wish we were all growing like that. Okay. Well, that's very basic demand for housing, and the supply has not been keeping up. So that's why prices would go up in the first place. But of course, if you're sitting there thinking, well, in the next 3 or 4 years, I'm going to buy a house, and you see prices going up 10%, 12% per year, fear of missing out takes over, and you get in there and you get in the bidding wars, and it gets going. So this is what was going on in Toronto and Vancouver, and it was fueled as well, as we know, by foreign buyers. So the policies that were put in place locally was to tax foreign buyers to try and limit some of that fallout. And at the same time, roughly, the new guidelines on mortgages came in, which meant you had to pass a 2 percentage point stress test when you're getting your mortgage. And that took, we think, around 25% of people out of the market for today, or at least at that price point. So they would need to search for something a little further out or a little less expensive, or a little smaller, what have you. And they're adjusting in various ways. So that was, none of those things, like the new mortgage underwriting guidelines and, of course, interest rate rises at the same time, all play a role, but those things weren't intended to stop prices from rising. They were aimed at making sure that people who did borrow borrowed safely, and that they would be resilient if the economy had a shock, either a bad shock, unemployment rose, or if interest rates rose as much as 2%. And they seem to be working very well that way. And it just so happens at the same time, the speculation has kind of come out of those marketplaces for now. In other markets like Hong Kong and Sydney, we've seen examples like this before where it comes back because the fundamentals are still very strong. So we'll have to wait and see.
Okay. And then the last thing on fiscal policy, not assigning white or black hats to any action by any government, but it was striking to me in what you said. The government of Canada is increasing its spending. as it has been.
Yeah.
The government of British Columbia is increasing spending. The government of Quebec is increasing spending.
Yes.
The Ontario government is restraining spending, and so much so, and the size of the Ontario economy is so great that that in itself counteracts the expansive fiscal policy of those three other governments.
Yes.
And in fact, it nets out to about a 0.2% of GDP slowdown.
That's correct.
That's really striking.
Well, I mean, I'm not going to judge it one way or the other. It depends on what your fiscal objectives are, of course. But it's just, as I said, just an arithmetic thing for us. We had whatever announced policies are in place, we insert them into our models. So the previous government had, growing expenditures in several categories, and the new government has either lower or zero growth in some of those categories, and that just means 1 year, 2 years from now, there's less government spending planned. That's not about their policies or anything, it's just a mechanical thing. But yeah, it was large enough that it made a difference, like you say, 0.2 percentage points on GDP net, whereas we've been used to having a kind of a positive contribution from government for the last several years to growth through infrastructure and all those kinds of things. So right now, the update shows that there's a slight drag on growth coming from the fiscal side.
Okay.
Just small.
The upshot of all of these different considerations, including others that I haven't gone back to you on, is that you had been raising interest rates step by step since 2015, at a time when many observers found that policy of increasing interest rates to be quite audacious, and we all got used to it. And then since October, there have been no rate increases.
Right.
A little bit more than a year ago, in 2017, you said, we're quite close to home and getting closer. Turns out you weren't quite as close to home as you thought at that time. What does home look like, and why aren't we quite there yet?
Yeah, so home is my term. Home is a place where inflation is on target, running at 2%, and the economy is operating at its full potential. Running at capacity, unemployment's about as low as you can expect it to be. And so in that situation, what we'd say is inflation would sustainably stay at 2%. So that's what home would sound like. We emphasize that home is not actually an address. It's more like a neighborhood. So there's error terms around all of those things, inflation 1 to 3%, not exactly 2, that sort of thing. But so that we were actually, by that description, we were home through all of 2017 and most of 2018. The only thing that looked odd was that we were only home because interest rates were still extraordinarily low by historical standards. In fact, in inflation-adjusted terms, below zero, which sounds hard to believe that, somehow you need to get a negative rate of interest in order to have the economy performing at its normal place. So that suggested to us that there are headwinds still, forces acting on the economy that are continuing, and we need lower interest rates to counteract them and keep us in that neighborhood. And hopefully then those forces would gradually dissipate, and then interest rates, by Mother Nature, would gradually find their way up to something more normal. And we think, normal, we call neutral, when interest rates are no longer stimulating or restraining growth, and sort of now we say 2.25% to 3.25% for our interest rate. So that would be getting everything home. And we never got there because things have interfered, as we've described in your first question. And so new forces are acting, and they're significant enough that actually they've opened up excess capacity in the economy again. Not a lot, but enough that it's going to put downward pressure on inflation a year or a year and a half from now. And so what we've done is we've analyzed all that, and as I said, concluded that detour is that. It's a detour. It won't last that long. It's in the order of 6 months, a bit more, a couple of quarters. So Q4 and Q1, and actually we think the numbers from today are going to seem stronger to us. And in that case, that's a temporary effect on inflation, and it won't matter. We'll be, on target if we keep interest rates where they are. And what we have to do then is wait to see if the data prove to us that we're right about that. And assuming we are, then sometime down the road we'll be able to say, okay, now it's time to start normalizing again. But that remains to be seen. It's a very data-dependent situation.
Okay. Folks in my line of work sometimes talk about the looming recession. Is there a looming recession?
No, I don't know why you talk about looming recessions. But anyway,
Have you met anyone in my line of work?
yes, I still don't know why you talk about looming recessions. But I know that some people would say, you know, historically there have been recessions at least every 10 years, that kind of thing. So that does cause people to wonder, you know, how long can this last? That's one way to pose the question. And the answer is to look at the history of recessions, what has caused them. Most recessions historically have been caused by central banks tightening policy to offset inflation pressures. And the others, and that's the two most recent ones, have been caused by some form of imbalances that emerged that, you know, were disruptive. And so the U.S. Housing bubble, you know, in 2007, 2008, as the obvious example. And that caused a global recession, the Great Recession we call it now, and it was, you know, all the ingredients of the Second Great Depression. So you had all the G20 central banks and fiscal authorities putting, you know, loading all their photon torpedoes, like everything that they had, and averted that very successful piece of policymaking. It's been climbing out of that hole for the past 10 years. That makes it seem like a long time. But there's all we've got is, you know, here and there an imbalance that we're watching, but there's nothing to signal that we're on the verge of anything like that.
Okay. President Trump has done a few things on tariffs especially that I know preoccupy you. Is there any way that story could turn so sour as to provoke a new global recession?
Oh, certainly. I mean, when we think about the gains in income and living standards that have been created by trade liberalization in the post-war period, to erase even a portion of those would be to risk causing a recession, global one. And it's worse than that, Paul, in the sense that just think about what a trade war looks like. You put tariffs on things. So we have in real life, we have steel and aluminum tariffs. Well, you know, other countries don't ship enough steel and aluminum to the United States to just countervail and make a level playing field and make that even. What they think of is, well, how much revenue is the U.S. government collecting on those tariffs? And now we need a bunch of tariffs that add up to the same amount of money to make it like an even battle. And so you end up putting tariffs on a whole bunch of other things, selected things, in order to put pressure on the United States to change their policy. So you've distorted many prices like that, and all of them went up. So when the price of your favorite item goes up, that means you have less money in your pocket for other things. So we know when you put tariffs on things, it makes people worse off. Now there may be a factory somewhere that's being protected by those things that actually stabilizes their employment and in some sense is better off. But we know that that's against the greater good. That's how trade liberalization works. So we're unwinding that. And the big problem with that, that's even worse than how I've just described it, is that think about the slowdown in investment that I talked about before. When a company makes an investment, what are they doing? They're increasing their capacity to produce. They're making a more efficient operation. If they stop doing that, what happens is the capacity of the economy to produce slows down. So it's what economists call supply shock. The ability of economies to grow is diminished at the same time that prices are rising. So you get what looks like a recession, but actually it isn't. It's structural. It's that the economy is slowing down forever, okay, while prices are rising. Now, most people think that if that happens, central banks will just cut rates and everything will be okay again. And I can assure you it's not nearly that simple. That it's just like Brexit, it's a supply shock of that type too. And so it's not a no-brainer. What is the right policy? In fact, monetary policy is not really able to offset that kind of shock. So it's truly unfortunate that all those gains are being put at risk. I'm one of those. I'm a positive thinker. I think everybody understands this well enough that deals will be made and that we will come out of this, and that's going to be a boost to the world economy when that uncertainty lifts. But of course, it is possible that it escalates, in which case it's the opposite. But right now, we're somewhere in between. Modest direct effects, but the big one is sentiment. And that means we could turn it around pretty quickly with a resolution of those stresses.
The situation you described where productive capacity does not increase as inflation does increase is why you've been using a term that I haven't heard since I was in high school, which is stagflation.
Right. So there you go. I haven't heard it since I was in University of Queens. So, but anyway, but yes, it's the 1970s. It was exactly that. The reason why we had the great inflation of the 1970s, there are lots of contributing reasons. The monetary expansion came from financing the Vietnam War, and of course the the Bretton Woods system was crumbling. So all those things were important factors. Read Paul Volcker's memoir; it's fantastic on this. But what's more important is that central banks thought, oh, the economy's slowing. So they kept interest rates low in order to offset those forces. And since it was a supply disturbance, not a demand disturbance, that caused inflation just to accumulate. And it took a very long time to get that out of the system and get our economies functioning normally again. So that's why we call it stagflation. Economy slows, inflation rises. And actually the best tool then is for a central bank to say, no, that's not going to happen again. We may have to even raise interest rates in this situation, not lower them, in order to prove that we care a lot about that 2% inflation target. That's what it's meant to do, keep you out of trouble.
Okay. And again, to back up just a little bit and make sure I understood what you said, the response to to Trump's initial tariff, the rebuttal that was offered by Canada's government and many other governments,
retaliatory measure,
compounds the effect of those tariffs.
Oh, absolutely it does. But you have to ask, well, if it's going to make the story worse, why? Well, I don't think there's really a choice in that, because your companies are put on an unlevel playing field, and of course everybody's saying, well, no, you got to somehow keep us even. And that's politics. It's a very hard job to do. It's the only real way out of it is for people to understand that any war is counterproductive. Let's get that job done and get these things signed up. All the time that's passing is not without cost either, right? So it's not like we're not paying a cost until it happens. We're paying a cost now.
In fact, last fall, when people were asking you about all the bad things that could happen, people in my line of work, you were saying, yeah, but there's upside possibilities too, and we have to, and what you kept repeating as an upside example was the end of NAFTA uncertainty and the arrival of a deal. But that hasn't paid off as much as one might have hoped, because it's not ratified. It could conceivably not be ratified. And meanwhile, the tariffs have stayed on, perhaps against expectations.
Yes. So far, it hasn't worked out as we hoped. But if we go back a year ago, markets were completely convinced that there would never be progress on it. And that's, I know it did seem grim at the time. At the time, we said, well, I don't think we should assume the worst case scenario. Right now, we've got some issues like slow investment because people are uncertain. But if we get this thing, if the government's able to negotiate a new NAFTA, CUSMA we call it.
USMACA actually is my preferred pronunciation.
USMACA?
Yeah.
Well, that's sort of an American term, but I think around here we're calling it CUSMA. But anyway, but the point is that as a policymaker, I can't be sitting there thinking, oh, I've got to make policy based on the worst scenario I can think of. Nor, of course, can I choose the best scenario. I have to be thinking about that risk on both sides and think, all right, so if they do sign, well, the economy is going to get a boost, and so we got to be, positioned for that. or if it does get torn up, then we're going to have a negative thing. But let's not go to the two fences. And I think we were the only ones that said, hang on, let's have a balanced approach to this. And sure enough, a couple of months later, we got a signature. And you could just feel the relief in corporate Canada. That was fantastic. Then I think what happened was there was talk about whether, in order to level the playing field on taxes, maybe the government would do something about accelerated capital depreciation, that sort of thing. And so I think investment didn't pick up yet. It just sort of waited to see if that, and it did happen, right? It happened in the fall economic statement. And so we're expecting to see stronger investment coming as the new year data, and we don't have any new investment data yet from 2019. We're expecting it to be stronger. Our surveys of companies from our boss, the Outlook survey, it suggests strong investment intentions. So of course, if you're highly influenced by CUSMA or not CUSMA, you might still be hesitating. But there's lots of companies that aren't, reliant purely on that. So I'm expecting to see investment numbers come in pretty well. And that's investment and then capacity to export more. That's exactly what we need as the engine of growth. Less housing, because housing has moderated as we expected it would.
All of this is a preoccupation of yours professionally and academically, which is modeling uncertainty.
Yes.
Getting better at understanding what you don't know is going to happen. Mm-hmm. Do you think that central banks in the past have erred on the side of overconfidence in their predictions?
I think central bankers have a habit of trying to identify the risks on both sides of their calls. And I mean, if you go back to years and years of monetary policy reports, they always say here at the back, here's the 5 or 6 risks that we're monitoring, and there's always some that are positive and some are negative, so they can say, we think this is a balanced forecast. I mean, no good forecaster is going to give you a biased forecast, not intentionally, and so for sure not in a policy space. So I don't think that, but methodologically though, what we do is we say, okay, there are the risks. Now let's just pretend they aren't going to happen. And so all the risks collapse to zero, and then we make policy based on that, and then we say, okay, there's the policy, and then the risks happen of one form or another. We can do a better job of it today by modeling it, as you suggested, directly, which is to say, it's more a question of not doing the optimal thing, but rather doing a risk-managed thing. And so the example of NAFTA is a really good one, because if we had believed, the way the markets were acting, well, we would have been maybe thinking about cutting rates because it looked like the economy was going to slow. Well, it didn't until we got to the end of the year, and that's really the oil thing and the global thing. So we already had the NAFTA uncertainty captured. So I think it would have been a mistake to have ignored that risk and balancing it as a positive versus negative. Anyway, I'm making it sound more scientific than it is. It's a very judgmental thing, okay? So I'll fess up to that.
Okay. More of an art than a science?
Well, there's lots of science in it. So I mean, I don't mean that it's suddenly all art, but what I do mean is that we can often make it sound more mechanical or hard science than it actually is. In practice, there's an awful lot of, there's a lot of micro judgments, and they all add up to a big judgment, and in the end you put an overlay and you're asking yourself, well, what are the big mistakes that I'm missing that could really throw off this policy decision? And that's what I mean by risk management. You guard against that as opposed to just assuming it won't happen.
Okay. This may be the moment to ask a question I've been wondering. What makes a young economics student want to grow up to be a central bank president?
I don't really know. I mean, I went to school, I grew up in Ottawa, and I went to Queens in '74. I know that sounds like a really long time ago to you, but it doesn't seem that long really. But I went there to become a doctor, and took all the pre-med courses and stuff. But when you get into those life sciences courses, they always say, well, you can take 4 of these, but you have to pick something else as an option. And I couldn't for the life of me figure out what to take. I always liked math and science. That's all I really wanted to do. And somebody talked me into just trying economics. It was just a stroke of luck, actually. So I fell in love. It's like somebody introduced you to somebody and you fall in love with them, and you go, how did that happen, you know? So anyway, it's the same thing with a subject like that. And so I still could have, I did everything I had to do to apply to med school, but never did. So just stayed with economics. And in 1974, when I first figured out what it is the Bank of Canada was and what it does, I thought, yeah, that's where I'd like to go. Yeah, and it's funny how you just sort of, it captivated me. And so that's been a really long quest. But I went there right out of school in 1981. I went there in 1978 as a summer student. I've had a long association with the bank.
Thiessen, Dodge, Carney, your immediate predecessors, basically since you got into the bank economist game, what would you say are their greatest hits? What are the things that the bank governors have done in the last generation that have had a real effect on the Canadian economy?
Wow. Okay. Well, so I worked for Bowie, Crow, Thiessen. I never worked, I worked with David when he was at finance, but anyway. And so there is a list of greatest hits there. It's a good way to put it. I mean, if we go back all the way to Bowie, it was the wrestling with inflation and deciding, you know, we've got to target money, which was the fashion in the macroeconomics world. And when I first came to the bank, that was what they were wrestling with. And we ended up proving that it wouldn't work very well. I mean, that launched the quest for the next thing, which was inflation targets. So I was in the research team that did all that. And then it was Crow brought that across the finish line and brought that orthodoxy and very tough-mindedness to it. And sure enough, you know, that was a very difficult period. Gordon was, you know, by then inflation was mostly wrestled to the ground, not quite to the ground. But his big move was, I think, transparency. He created the governing council, for one thing, which is something I admired at the time, and now I'm very happy that it, because you know, governor was always sort of a personalized thing, and the idea is to have a governing council so that it's a team. And I think that's something we've achieved in the last few years, the visibility of the team. Deputy governors giving update speeches, talking to the media, and of course the senior deputy governor acting almost full-time as a policymaker rather than as a COO. So that's been a great innovation, I think, and it's made the teamwork look great. I mean, Dodge, you know, admired from outside, and then of course Carney came along and did right at the time of the crisis. That was kind of a crisis made for him. I mean, he masterminded that, and so that was, I was a couple of blocks away at EDC and watched that pretty close at hand. So anyway, everybody's got something, and so far no crisis. That's okay with me. Yeah, it's okay with me.
Did you worry about the shoes you'd have to fill when Carney left, went off to play with Aerosmith or whatever it is he's doing now?
Oh, no, not really. I mean, I had the advantage of having grown up in the bank. I had a sense of what the role, you know, looked like from the inside, and had been able to observe several governors pretty closely, and knew that, you know, different conditions would give different settings. But, you know, there's no question. I mean, do you remember who it was who replaced Wayne Gretzky when he retired?
No.
No.
I wouldn't know.
That's what I'm saying. So, you know, I run into people on the street and they ask me, hey, how's Mark? And I'm like, great, and I'm doing okay too. Yeah. So.
I assume you speak to him not as the guy who needs to keep tabs on Carney, but as central bank governor to central bank governor.
Yes.
The level of coordination among bank governors is higher than usual, I expect, in a weird time.
It's very high. I mean, I would say there's always been a tradition of that. The Basel meetings, you know, are basically every second month, around 6 to 8 weeks apart, and you know, at least the 15 biggest ones have dinner together, and there's a wide open conversation. You know, what happens in Basel stays in Basel, that kind of thing, and that's extraordinarily positive. It's very useful to know just what it is that's on Jay's mind or Mark's mind or Mario's, so that you know what are they wrestling with, what's next, and you share war stories, right? So it's very, very cool. Yeah.
Is there a feeling of being sort of the groundskeepers during the world's biggest frat party? There's this guy, there's this president who is doing wildly unpredictable things when you are the stewards of predictability.
So I'm not going to repeat the premise that was in that question, but there's no question that politics has intruded in many dimensions more than normal. I mean, there's in any given year there's always some geopolitical risk that erupts or whatever. It's hardly ever in one of our major countries. So politics has definitely become a much bigger factor in trying to figure out what's going to happen next and what are the risks that we face. But in the end, I think we may be overcomplicating it. I mean, I think the experience of what we went through after the crisis kind of gave people an exaggerated impression of what central banks can do for them. Our ability to control all these things and keep them under control is kind of a little too lofty in most people's minds. It's why we chose inflation targets. It was like, doesn't sound that hard, and yet it is pretty hard, and it is the one thing that we can contribute to a more stable environment for people to make decisions in. And all the other things that you might raise, I mean, there's somebody else's job. I mean, central banks only have one tool, and we can only aim at one thing, and that is the most important thing. And so all the other things that they think we can take care of, well, not actually. We can be good advisors, and if people are ready to listen to it.
Okay. We've all also had to learn that the president's Twitter account is not synonymous with the government, the U.S. administration's action, but he is frequently highly critical of your counterpart at the Fed and has hinted that he might constrain the autonomy of the Fed by replacing the chair. Right. Do you find yourself having to explain why independent central banks are a good thing more than you might otherwise have had to do?
Yes, and here we are.
Why are independent central banks a good thing, sir?
So, I mean, the topic is in the air, and I think partly I would not blame all of this on one individual. I would say, go back to what I said a moment ago. I think the experience from 2008 till now has given people an exaggerated impression of what central banks can achieve. You've seen the book, The Only Game in Town, and all that kind of stuff. Well, that's, I said, exaggerated, and central banks can't be made accountable for more than a limited number of things. And so I think if people think we're actually in charge of lots of things, well, naturally in a democratic society, people say, well, we need more influence, as the elected officials over what those things are. If we're clear about it, really, we're in a position to provide a stable macroeconomic environment, and that's about it. And inflation is the main way to do that. And if you think about that, well, there's nothing much to argue about there. Central banks were created because there was a presumption that governments would always prefer more inflation, especially towards election times. That would goose the economy, and if the inflation came, it would come after the election, and all that's some other issue, right? And so central banks were created to guard against that, and it's the independence that makes sure that that line doesn't get crossed. But independence is it's kind of a relative concept. It's here in Canada we have inflation target agreement with the federal government, and we have operational independence to pursue that. But that setting every 5 years is a matter of public debate and so on. So, and we are accountable to Parliament. I have to go next week. I got to go sit in committee in Parliament, both the House and then the Senate the next day. That's our accountability framework. Yesterday I had to explain everything in a press conference, and that's all part of the accountability to the public. So I think there's a lot of checks and balances there. So I think independence is a good thing. It's if markets thought it was actually being eroded, then what you'd see is investors would say, I'm worried about there might be a surge of inflation, in election year, say in 2020, for example, and they would demand a premium to lend the U.S. government money, right? And we would all notice that. All the bond yields in the world would go up if that were the case. Right now, term premium are as low as they can go. But if they started to widen out because of inflation risk, then every citizen everywhere would pay the price for that to finance the debt. So we all have a stake in that inflation control. I'll tell you one last thing on this independence thing. When was the last time you were in a Chinese restaurant and you got a fortune cookie that actually meant something to you?
Not nearly often enough.
Okay, so I'm going to show you something.
Here we go.
So 6 weeks ago, when all that hype was going on, I got this at the Mandarin Ogilvy just down the road, and you can read it out to the folks.
You are independent politically.
So my answer to that question is Confucius say. Okay, I thought that was quite a stroke of luck. Actually, you don't get that every day.
That's almost the strangest thing I've ever seen.
It's a keeper, keeping my wallet for a while anyway.
You talk about transparency. One element of transparency is even giving press conferences like yesterday's. It used to be that the bank didn't explain when it wasn't changing rates.
Yeah. So we've made that a habit, and in a few weeks we'll do the financial stability report, financial system report, the FSR. We'll do a press conference for that. We do press conferences after the speeches. And again, that's all part of that dialogue. The other thing we've done in the last 4 or 5 years is we've scientifically made our reports and our press releases and speeches more readable. Say using those tools about, what grade level are you writing at? And, they used to be, sort of really advanced, very subtle stuff. And I remember the old joke, I don't know, a governor who I won't name told me, Steve, I do all my best writing between the lines. And I thought, well, that's part of the art, isn't it? We don't do that anymore. We try to be straightforward and clear, and we're aiming sort of at for sure in a sort of a high school kind of zone, so people can say that I get it. That's no problem for me to appreciate what it is you're up to. So those are elements of transparency. The other thing is the opening statement after our deliberations. We used to just read the press release, more or less. Well, you can already read the press release, but now we have an opening statement that I or Carolyn write just before we go before the media, and that summarizes the things that the governing council has deliberated in detail. What issues were really, that's the 4 things you named before. And that too is sort of like minutes, but if you ever looked at central bank minutes, they're gargantuan and again, impossible to decipher. Thousands and thousands of words, and our minutes would be like that too. It wouldn't be very useful, but I think what we've provided there is a capsule that allows people to understand, yeah, I can see how you debate that for a couple of days before you chose not to raise interest rates or whatever.
The equivalent of the governing council for the Fed, the FOMC,
yes,
actually releases its minutes some months down the line.
Yes.
Governing council minutes never become public. Is that something that could change?
Well, there aren't minutes, and there's a difference in the sense that the FOMC, there's a number of people who represent constituencies, right? That's the history of that structure. And we don't have that. We just have 6 experts around the table. We don't think of ourselves as representing any particular area or anything. And so I think that gives a much more free-for-all debate for us. I mean, I certainly wouldn't want the kinds of debates that I have minuted. And so, of course, they wouldn't be, would they? What would happen would be we would have more formal, this is what I believe and here are the reasons, and that would be in a minute, and you'd be like, oh, well, I heard that before. And so I think the system we have of checks and balances is at least as good as the one you're describing. I don't think publishing minutes really adds anything to it.
We've got a bit more than 10 minutes left. So fortunately, the next thing I want to talk about is big, and so we got some time.
Okay.
Which is what are we even talking about when we talk about the Canadian economy? And what spurs that is a speech that you gave in Nunavut 3 weeks ago.
Iqaluit, yeah.
In Iqaluit. And you talked about the extent to which services and sophisticated human interaction is a huge chunk of the Canadian economy.
Yes.
It's common around here because of frustration over pipelines to say that Canada is becoming a bad investment risk because big projects don't get anywhere in Canada. And yet the argument you made is that those sorts of projects, making big things, are not where the game is. They're not where the growth is, and they're not the only consideration when we talk about the Canadian economy. So maybe you just run with that for a bit.
Sure. By the way, aren't I lucky? You know, when they say you're going to give 6 speeches in a year, where would you like to give them? And I got to spend a couple of days in Iqaluit and took a dog sled ride and that sort of thing. That was very cool. And everywhere I go, I meet hardworking people building businesses out of thin air, and it's fantastic. And most of those businesses that are being built out of thin air are in some sense or some way connected to what we now loosely call the digital economy. And so I think profoundly we are digitalizing more and more of our economy. That could take the form of automation in some areas or artificial intelligence in others. But what's more to the point is that oil, for example, is always going to be a really important part of it. It's $80 billion a year. It's our biggest export. It's not going to change. It can't grow much until we get a pipeline, but it's still there every single day. We'd be missing that money, if that wasn't happening. But on top of that, where is new growth coming from? It is coming from the service side of the economy, and by services, often people start thinking like, the person that served you a coffee or whatever, which of course is a legitimate job. But no, we're talking about the big growth areas, the fastest growing areas are IT services. This is the largest export growth category is IT services. It's the highest growth in employment. We're talking an economy that's growing around 7 to 8% per year. And if we take IT, engineering, professional services, and as well tourism, which sounds like low grade, the person at the ski hill, whatever. But no, tourism includes all education services, which is a huge business for us. Foreign students, and they come not just paying tuition, they're spending 4 years here or what have you, and spending all that money too. So that's all tracked. Those are really big exports. And so nowadays, something like close to 25% of our exports are services. Our economy is over 80% services. The other 20% is manufacturing and resources and so on. Still matters very much. We'd miss that 20% terribly. But what I illustrated in Iqaluit is if we take the key services that would include those things in healthcare, which are growing fast, about 50% of the economy is growing by almost 5% per year. Now the other 50% of the economy is growing much more slowly, and some of it is actually working hard, like in the oil sector, to overcome headwinds. But it's important to know that we have kind of like 2 economies going on out there, both very important, but where is the growth going to come from in the future? I see those prospects coming from that service side. And some of it is hard to measure. It may be bigger already than we think. I'm just hearing today about companies, today they don't invest in servers and have a back office. They just pay a monthly fee to a company and the stuff's all in the cloud. Well, where's the investment gone? The investment doesn't happen anymore. Some company bought servers, but now they don't need half as many servers because your server's only not even half full, right? So a company can provide all those services in a economies of scale way. Is it captured properly? Well, so far it's a project in progress. So I think one of these days we're going to discover we were building a lot more prosperity than we thought as our data improve in this modern economy.
Okay. I want to first test the question about natural resources, including oil. You're not sure the growth is there in the future, even if we get a pipeline built?
Oh, no. There would be, I think though, the growth is more an organic growth, that we would expect to see. I mean, the global oil market grows perhaps 2% per year. And with extra pipeline capacity, we could bump up to a higher output level. That's true, but we have to be mindful that the U.S. Oil sector is growing by leaps and bounds. It won't last forever, of course, but the whole scene is changing. But on the resource side, the food sector has extraordinary promise there. The planet is still growing, and food is a key issue. Simple things like fertilizer, potash, that sort of thing. These are big growth opportunities for Canada, and they're actually happening. So, I mean, I think we should have a very positive outlook for our economy.
Okay. And on the rest of the picture, the fact that 80% of the economy is in services, my ears perked up when I read that because the music director of the orchestra here, the fantastic conductor of the orchestra, which is services, is Alexander Shelley, who's a young Brit who spent most of his career in Germany. And because he's curious and he knows I'm a journalist, he keeps asking me, what does Canada make? What does it build? What does it export? And being Germany, he expects the answer to be heavy machinery and stuff. Yeah. And I always feel stupid when he asks me that question, and the answer is what we serve, what we make and build and export and sell is sophisticated human interaction.
Yeah.
Banking, tourism, education. How do we safeguard that if that's where the growth is?
Well, you safeguard that, I think, by reminding yourself how you got there. And I think we've seen good signs on this. So you get there by having the right skills in your workforce. So education is the best investment that can be made to continue to grow those businesses. And indeed, education in a broader sense for those who may get stressed or need to redeploy because of automation or the digital economy. We need to be ready as a society to make significant investments in those things. They will pay off big time for us. We don't have to be skimpy on those files.
How is Canada doing on that front?
Well, my impression is a very positive one. And we're building a huge reputation in some of these fields that, where they're, AI is a classic example, or quantum computing, or for that matter, things that are as ordinary as engineering services. We're class in this. If you look at financial services, our firms, the banks and insurance companies, were pioneers in exporting those services. So huge businesses, half the revenue of a given bank comes from offshore. An entire building in downtown Toronto full of people that administer a business that's actually outside of Canada. Well, that means all that managerial talent is an export. We don't count it as an export. It's just people on the payroll of that bank. But it is an export.
You're in your last year as the central bank governor?
Yeah. My mandate ends about a year from now, yeah.
Are you expecting smooth sailing from here to the exit door?
Well, according to our forecast, the answer is yes.
I'll try and do what I can not to jinx it. Our time here has run out. I really want to thank you for giving us this sophisticated but understandable overview of how the Canadian economy is doing. I want to thank our sponsors at the Canadian Bankers Association, our partners at CPAC, and the National Arts Centre. I want to thank all of you for coming out tonight. We have a reception next door. I hope you can come and join us. And I want to thank Stephen Poloz for being our guest tonight.
It was my pleasure, Paul. Thank you.